Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The paradox of value, why what we need most costs least. An economist contemplates the nature of value, asks what makes things valuable, what determines worth, and observes a fundamental puzzle that prices seem disconnected from importance, that markets assign high prices to luxuries and low prices to necessities, that goods essential for human flourishing cost little while goods that serve vanity or status cost fortunes. And this is the paradox of value, the broader version of the diamond water paradox, the puzzle that spans across all goods and services. And the paradox asks why healthcare is expensive, while entertainment is cheap in some places and the reverse in others. Why teachers are paid less than entertainers. Why life-saving drugs are affordable in some markets and unaffordable in others. Why the allocation of value by markets seems misaligned with human needs, with moral worth, with social importance. And this paradox has troubled economic thinking since ancient times, has been discussed by philosophers from Aristotle to Marx. And while modern economics offers explanations through supply and demand, through marginal utility, through market equilibrium, the paradox retains moral force, retains the sense that something is wrong, that prices should reflect importance, that markets fail to value correctly, and the paradox of value remains a central challenge for defending market allocation, for justifying price mechanisms, for explaining why efficient markets can produce what seem like perverse valuations. Imagine comparing different goods by their importance to human welfare. And air is essential, sustains life, is necessary for survival, cannot be done without for more than minutes. And yet air is free, has zero price, costs nothing. While gold is non-essential, serves no biological function, is desired only for decoration or a store of value, and yet gold is expensive, costs thousands per ounce, and this comparison illustrates the paradox, shows that necessity and price are inversely related, that the most needed goods are often cheapest, and the least needed goods often expensive. And this pattern extends across many goods. Water is cheap, housing varies but is often expensive, healthcare is expensive in many places, education costs are rising, food prices are moderate, while luxuries like jewellery, sports cars, yachts, artwork, all command premium prices. And the pattern suggests that markets value incorrectly, value luxury over necessity, value status over survival. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that market allocation is unjust, is misaligned with human values. The paradox of value demonstrates the tension between exchange value, what markets assign, and use value, what humans need. And Marx emphasized this distinction, argued that capitalism systematically undervalues use value, undervalues goods necessary for life, while overvaluing exchange value, overvaluing goods that serve accumulation. And this misalignment is not accidental, but is structural, is inherent in market systems that allocate based on willingness to pay rather than on need. And those with money can bid up prices of luxuries, while those without cannot bid up prices of necessities. And markets respond to money, not to need. And this explains the paradox. It explains why diamonds are expensive and water cheap. Because those who want diamonds have money to pay high prices, while those who need water cannot afford high prices. And markets clear at prices that balance supply and demand among those with purchasing power, not among all humans with needs. Visualize the paradox as revealing different concepts of value: economic value, defined by market prices determined by supply and demand, and purchasing power, and moral or social value, defined by importance to human welfare, determined by needs and flourishing. and these two concepts diverge, are not aligned. And economic value is amoral, is neutral about what should be valued, reflects only what is valued by those with money to spend, while moral value judges that some goods are more important than others, that necessities matter more than luxuries, that human needs should be prioritized. And the paradox is the gap between these concepts, is the recognition that markets do not track moral value, do not allocate according to importance. And this gap creates the sense that markets are unjust, are inadequate for distributing goods that matter most. One response to the paradox of value is that markets are efficient, are good at allocating resources to maximize satisfaction of preferences weighted by willingness to pay. And while this may not align with moral importance, it is the best available system, is better than alternatives, like central planning, which face information problems and incentive problems. And markets at least respond to decentralized information about preferences, at least allow individuals to make choices, and efficiency does not require tracking moral importance, requires only that resources go to those who value them most as measured by willingness to pay. And this response accepts the paradox, accepts that markets do not and should not track moral value, argues that moral allocation should be achieved through other means, through taxation and redistribution, through public provision of essential goods, through regulation that ensures access to necessities, and markets should be left to allocate efficiently while other institutions address moral concerns. Another response questions whether the paradox is real, argues that necessities actually are valuable, are provided at low cost because markets are efficient at producing them, because competition drives prices down, and the reason necessities are cheap is that we have solved the production problem, have made them abundant, and abundance is good, is the goal. And the paradox mistakes low price for low value, confuses market price with social importance. And in fact, low prices for necessities mean high consumer surplus, mean people benefit greatly from access to cheap necessities. And this is success, not failure. Is markets working well? Not markets failing. And the paradox dissolves once we recognize that low prices for necessities reflect abundance and efficiency rather than lack of value, and high prices for luxuries reflect scarcity and inefficiency rather than high value. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that markets misallocate, argues that essential goods should not be left to markets, should be provided through public systems, through universal healthcare, through public education, through subsidized housing, and markets can allocate luxuries, can determine who gets diamonds and yachts. But necessities are different, require different allocation mechanisms, require ensuring universal access regardless of ability to pay. And this social democratic response uses the paradox to argue for limits on markets, for sectors where market allocation is inappropriate, where public provision is necessary, and the paradox becomes an argument for mixed economies, for market allocation in some domains and public allocation in others. The paradox also appears in labour markets, where compensation seems misaligned with social importance, and teachers are paid less than entertainers, nurses less than financiers, social workers less than lawyers, and this pattern suggests that markets undervalue socially important work, undervalue contributions to welfare and education and care, while overvaluing contributions to entertainment and finance. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that labour markets are unjust, and explaining the pattern requires understanding supply and demand for labour, requires recognising that compensation reflects scarcity and productivity as measured by market value, not social importance, and teachers are abundant relative to demand while CEOs are scarce, and market productivity of CEOs as measured by profit contribution exceeds that of teachers. And these factors determine compensation, not social importance. And this explains the pattern but does not eliminate the moral concern, does not resolve the sense that something is wrong with a system that pays entertainers more than educators. Some argue that the paradox of value reveals limits of price as measure of value, reveals that not everything important can be priced, that some goods resist commodification, that markets are appropriate for some goods and inappropriate for others, and market prices are useful for allocating produced commodities but are inadequate for allocating access to health, education, safety, justice, and these latter goods require different allocation mechanisms, require treating them as rights or entitlements rather than as commodities to be purchased. And the paradox supports this view, supports the idea that markets have limits, that not everything should be for sale, that some forms of value resist market logic. The necessities remain cheap, the luxuries remain expensive, and the paradox persists. Prices diverge from importance, exchange value diverges from use value, markets allocate without regard to need, and the pattern continues, and the paradox of value endures as a permanent feature of market systems, endures as a moral challenge to market allocation, and resolving the tension requires either accepting that markets are amoral, are efficient but not just, and supplementing markets with institutions that ensure access to necessities, or rejecting markets for essential goods, replacing market allocation with public provision. And the paradox remains unresolved and troubling, showing that what we need most costs least, that prices do not track importance, that markets value incorrectly from a moral perspective, even if correctly from an economic perspective, and the paradox endures. The potato paradox. A farmer harvests 100 kilograms of potatoes, and these potatoes are 99% water by weight, meaning that only 1 kilogram is solid potato material and 99 kilograms is water. And the farmer leaves the potatoes out in the sun to dry, and after some time the water content has decreased. The potatoes are now 98% water instead of 99%. And the question is posed, how much do the potatoes weigh now? And the intuitive answer is that they have lost a little water, perhaps 1 kilogram, and so they now weigh 99 kilograms, or perhaps 98 kilograms. But this intuition is wildly wrong. The correct answer is that the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. They have lost half their weight, and this shocking result is the potato paradox, a puzzle about percentages and proportions that reveals how badly human intuition handles these concepts. The calculation proceeds as follows. The solid potato material, the non-water part, weighs 1 kilogram both before and after drying. This does not change. The potatoes lose water but not solid material. And before drying, this 1 kilogram of solid material represents 1% of the total weight, because the potatoes are 99% water and 1% solid, and after drying, this same 1 kilogram of solid material must represent 2% of the total weight, because the potatoes are now 98% water and therefore 2% solid. And if 1 kilogram is 2% of the total weight, then the total weight must be 50 kilograms, because 1 kilogram divided by 2% equals 50 kilograms. And so the potatoes have lost 50 kilograms of water, going from 100 kilograms to 50 kilograms, even though the percentage of water has decreased by only 1 percentage point, from 99% to 98%. The paradox reveals how deceptive percentages can be, how a small change in percentage can correspond to a large change in absolute quantity, and the confusion arises from conflating different reference points. The percentage of water is calculated relative to the total weight, which itself changes as water is lost. And so the meaning of 99% water before drying is different from the meaning of 98% water after drying, because the total weight is different. And this shifting reference point makes the percentage decrease seem small when in fact it corresponds to a massive, absolute loss of water. Another way to see the solution is to focus on the solid material. Before drying, the ratio of water to solid is 99:1, and after drying the ratio is 98:2, which simplifies to 49:1. and since the solid material remains 1 kilogram throughout, the water content must be 49 kilograms after drying, giving a total weight of 50 kilograms. And this calculation makes clear that the ratio of water to solid has nearly halved, from 99 parts water per part solid to 49 parts water per part solid. And this large change in ratio corresponds to the loss of half the total weight. The potato paradox has analogues in many real-world contexts where percentages and proportions are used. In economics, where small percentage changes in large quantities can represent enormous absolute changes. In medicine, where changes in concentrations or doses must be carefully calculated to avoid errors. In environmental science, where changes in atmospheric composition are measured in parts per million but can have large effects. And in all these contexts, the potato paradox serves as a warning that percentage changes can be misleading, that absolute quantities matter, and that careful calculation is necessary to avoid errors. The paradox also illustrates a general principle about proportions, that when the total changes, percentages relative to that total change in non-obvious ways, and that converting between percentages and absolute quantities requires attention to what the percentage is calculated relative to, and failure to track the denominator, failure to notice that the reference point is shifting, leads to systematic errors in reasoning, errors that the potato paradox exemplifies. Some people respond to the potato paradox by rejecting the premise, by arguing that potatoes cannot go from 99% water to 98% water by drying, that the numbers are unrealistic, but this response misses the point. The paradox is a thought experiment designed to illustrate mathematical relationships, and while the specific numbers may be exaggerated for effect, the underlying principle is sound, and similar calculations arise in realistic scenarios involving concentrations, dilutions, evaporations, and mixing, and understanding the potato paradox helps avoid errors in these practical contexts. The paradox is also pedagogically valuable. It is often used to teach proportional reasoning, to help students understand the difference between absolute and relative quantities, to emphasize the importance of identifying what a percentage is calculated relative to, and to show that intuition about percentages is often wrong, that careful calculation is necessary, and that problems involving changing totals require extra care. And students who master the potato paradox gain insight into a whole class of problems involving ratios, proportions, and percentages, problems that appear throughout mathematics, science, economics, and everyday life. The 100 kilograms of potatoes sit in the sun, water evaporating, and the percentage of water drops from 99 to 98. A change that sounds small, that feels negligible, and yet the weight has halved. 50 kilograms of water have disappeared, and the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. And this result shocks, violates expectation, reveals the gap between how percentages sound and what they mean, and the paradox endures, a simple problem with a surprising answer, a calculation that seems wrong but is right, a demonstration that percentages are tricky, that proportions shift in non-obvious ways, and that human intuition about these matters is unreliable, needs correction, needs training, needs the discipline of mathematics to avoid systematic error. And the paradox remains, taught in classrooms, discussed in puzzles, a permanent reminder that numbers are subtle, that context matters, that reference points shift, and that the gap between 99% and 98%, which sounds like 1%, can actually represent 50% of the total. And the potatoes shrink, the water evaporates, and the weight drops, and the paradox persists, elegant and instructive, a lesson in proportional reasoning wrapped in a story about potatoes and sunshine. The private language argument, why you cannot invent words only you understand. A person decides to create a private language, a language for describing inner sensations that only the person can experience, and the person picks a letter, say S, and decides that S will refer to a particular sensation, a specific feeling that recurs occasionally. And whenever the sensation occurs, the person writes S in a diary. And the person is the only one who knows what S means. The only one who can identify the sensation, because the sensation is private, is accessible only to the person who feels it. And this seems possible, seems like something anyone could do. Seems like we already do this to some extent when we give names to our own private experiences, but Ludwig Wittgenstein argues in his philosophical investigations that such a private language is impossible, that the scenario described involves a fundamental confusion about how language works, about what it means for a word to have meaning. And this is the private language argument, one of the most discussed and controversial arguments in 20th century philosophy, a challenge to the idea that we can give meaning to words through private mental acts of association, through inner ostensive definition, and an argument that meaning requires public criteria, requires shared practices, requires more than individual intention or inner recognition. Imagine the person using S over time, writing it when the sensation occurs, and now the question arises, how does the person know they are using S correctly? How does the person know that today's sensation is the same as yesterday's sensation, that both deserve the label S, and the person consults memory, remembers what S means, remembers the sensation, and judges that yes, the current sensation matches, deserves the label S. But Wittgenstein asks what makes this judgment correct. What distinguishes correctly remembering what S means from merely seeming to remember correctly? And in a public language, there are external checks. Other speakers can correct mistakes, can point out when a word is misused. But in a private language, there is no external check, no way to distinguish genuine correctness from apparent correctness, no way to distinguish following a rule from merely thinking one is following a rule, and so the distinction collapses. And if there is no distinction between being right and seeming right, then there is no meaning, no rule, no language, only the illusion of language. The argument can be stated as a dilemma. Either the private language user has a criterion for correct use of S, something that determines when S applies and when it does not, or the user has no criterion, and if there is a criterion, then it must be something public, something that could, in principle, be recognized by others. Because private criteria are impossible, cannot distinguish correct from incorrect application, and so the language is not really private. And if there is no criterion, then S does not have a meaning, does not refer to anything determinate, is just a mark that the user writes arbitrarily. And either way, private language fails. Either it is not really private or it is not really language, and the conclusion is that language requires public criteria, requires embedding in shared practices, requires more than inner acts of association. Visualize the private language user checking whether to apply S, looking inward, consulting the memory of what S means, and judging that the current sensation matches. And Wittgenstein compares this to buying several copies of the same newspaper to check whether the first copy was telling the truth. The consultation of memory is not an independent check, not a genuine verification, because memory itself might be mistaken, and there is no way within the private framework to correct memory, no external standard against which to test it. And so the whole enterprise collapses into subjectivity, into whatever seems right is right. And this destroys meaning, makes S meaningless, because there is no distinction between correct and incorrect use. The private language argument has profound implications for philosophy of mind, for theories of consciousness, for the question of whether mental states are purely private or whether they have public dimensions, and if private language is impossible, then purely private mental states are problematic, are not the kind of thing we can talk about or think about in determinate ways. And this suggests that even our inner lives, even our private experiences are shaped by public language, by shared concepts, by social practices. And there is no purely private realm of experience that exists independent of language and society. One response to the argument defends private language, argues that Wittgenstein's standards for meaning are too strict, that memory can serve as a criterion even if it is fallible, that we do have private access to our sensations, and that this access, combined with memory, is sufficient to ground meaning. And this response denies that meaning requires public criteria, argues that private ostensive definition is possible, that we can give names to our inner states through acts of attention and association. And while these names might be incorrigible, might admit of no external check, they are still meaningful, still refer determinately to experiences, and the private language argument fails to show otherwise. Another response accepts that individual private language is impossible, but argues that this does not threaten our understanding of consciousness or inner experience, because we do not actually use private language, we use public language to describe our inner states, and words like pain and sensation have public criteria, have behavioural and contextual conditions for application, and so there is no need for private language, no loss if private language is impossible, and the argument's conclusion, rather than being threatening, is liberating, shows that language is essentially social, that meaning is public, and that our inner lives are not sealed off, but are accessible through language and behaviour. A third response questions whether Wittgenstein's argument succeeds, argues that it proves too much, that if private language is impossible, then all language is impossible, because even public language requires individuals to remember meanings, to apply rules based on memory and judgment, and if memory is insufficient for private language, why is it sufficient for public language? And this response suggests that the private language argument creates a general skepticism about meaning that Wittgenstein himself would reject, that the argument needs to be refined to distinguish the legitimate role of memory in public language from the illegitimate role in private language, and making this distinction is difficult. The private language argument also connects to broader issues about rule following, about what it means to follow a rule, to do the same thing repeatedly, to continue a series, and Wittgenstein's point is that rule following is not a matter of inner interpretation, not a matter of grasping a meaning in the mind, but is a matter of practice, of training, of embedding in a community, and rules are constituted by practices rather than by mental states, and following a rule is doing what counts as correct within a practice, not doing what seems correct to an isolated individual. And this social account of rules shapes Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics, of logic, of language, and underlies the private language argument. The person sits with the diary with entries of S scattered through the pages, and the question remains whether S means anything, whether the person is using language or merely making marks. And Wittgenstein's argument says that without public criteria, without shared practices, without the possibility of correction by others, S is meaningless. The diary is not a record but a pretense, and the private language is not language at all. And the argument persists as one of the most challenging and important arguments in philosophy, an argument that has shaped discussions of meaning, of mind, of consciousness, and of the relationship between language and reality. And whether the argument succeeds remains disputed, remains a matter of ongoing philosophical debate, but its influence is undeniable, has changed how philosophers think about private experience, about meaning, about the conditions that make language possible, and the private language argument endures as a permanent challenge to Cartesian conceptions of mind, to the idea of a purely private inner realm, and to theories that ground meaning in individual mental acts rather than in public practices. And the diary sits closed, the S entries unreadable, meaningful, or meaningless depending on whether Wittgenstein is right, and the argument remains powerful and controversial, a landmark in 20th century philosophy. The problem of universals, why redness exists everywhere and nowhere. A philosopher observes that multiple objects share properties. Multiple things are red, multiple objects are round, multiple animals are cats, and this sharing, this commonality, requires explanation, requires understanding what it is for different things to have the same property. And this is the problem of universals, one of the oldest and most fundamental problems in metaphysics. The question of whether properties like redness or roundness or cathood are real entities that exist independently of particular objects, are universals that multiple particulars instantiate, or whether properties are merely names, merely words we use to group similar objects without corresponding to any real shared entity. And the problem divides philosophers into realists who accept that universals exist and nominalists who deny them, and both positions face difficulties. Both must explain how we think and talk about properties, how science discovers laws about kinds, how resemblance works, and neither position has one consensus. And the problem of universals remains one of the deepest questions in ontology, a question about the fundamental furniture of reality, about what kinds of things exist. Imagine two red objects, a red ball and a red shirt, and they share something, they are both red, and the question is what this sharing amounts to, what grounds the similarity. And the realist says both objects instantiate the same universal, the property redness, which exists as a separate entity, an abstract object that is somehow present in both particulars. And the universal redness is one thing that exists in multiple places, is wholly present in each red object. And this explains similarity, explains how multiple things can be red. They all instantiate the same universal, and the nominalist says there is no universal. There are only the particular red objects, and the similarity is primitive, is a brute fact, or is explained by resemblance. The objects resemble each other, or is explained by linguistic convention. We call both red using the same word, and redness is not a real entity, but is a feature of our language or conceptual scheme. The problem can be stated as a dilemma. Either properties are universals, abstract entities that exist independently of particulars, or properties are just features of particulars. And if properties are universals, then we face the problem of how abstract entities relate to concrete particulars, how universals are present in objects, whether they exist in Plato's realm of forms separate from physical reality, or exist in objects themselves, as Aristotle thought. And if properties are just features of particulars, then we face the problem of explaining resemblance, explaining what makes multiple objects similar, what grounds classification into kinds, and neither horn is comfortable. Neither provides an obvious easy answer. And the problem of universals forces us to choose between problematic metaphysics or problematic nominalism. Visualize the realist picture, a realm of abstract universals, redness, roundness, cathood, existing eternally and independently, and particular objects participating in these universals, instantiating them, exemplifying them, and an object is red by standing in an instantiation relation to the universal redness. And this relation is mysterious, is not itself explained. How do abstract universals connect to concrete particulars? How does the abstract realm interact with the physical realm? And the realist must either accept this as primitive, as an unexplained connection, or provide a theory of instantiation. And various theories have been proposed, but all face difficulties, all struggle to explain how universals and particulars relate. One version of realism, Platonic realism, says universals exist in a separate realm, a realm of forms, and particulars participate in forms, and the perfect circle exists in the realm of forms, and physical circles approximate it, participate in it imperfectly. And this explains how we can think about perfect circles, even though no physical object is perfectly circular. We grasp the form directly through reason, but the theory faces the problem of how we access the realm of forms, how our minds, which are physical, can connect to abstract entities, and the theory faces the problem of how participation works, how forms relate to particulars. And Aristotle rejected Platonic realism, argued that forms exist in particulars, are immanent in objects, not transcendent, and redness exists in red objects, is a component of them, and this avoids the separate realm, but creates other problems? How can one form be in many places? How can universals be divided among particulars? Nominalism rejects universals entirely, accepts only particulars, and explains similarity without appealing to shared properties. And various nominalist strategies exist. Resemblance nominalism says objects are similar because they resemble each other, and resemblance is primitive, not explained by shared properties. And redness is just the class of objects that resemble paradigm red objects. And this avoids commitment to universals but faces the problem that resemblance seems to presuppose properties, seems to require that objects share something. And if resemblance is primitive, then we have not really eliminated properties but renamed them. And resemblance nominalism faces technical difficulties with explaining degrees of resemblance, with avoiding circularity. Another nominalist approach, predicate nominalism, says properties are just predicates, just words, and redness is the predicate red, and objects are red by satisfying the predicate. And this linguistic nominalism faces the problem of explaining why predicates apply. What makes it true that an object satisfies red? And the answer seems to require properties after all, seems to presuppose that objects have features that make predicates apply, and so predicate nominalism seems to presuppose what it denies, seems to need properties to explain predication. A third nominalist approach, trope theory, accepts that properties exist but denies that they are universals, argues that properties are particulars, are individual instances, and each red object has its own individual redness, its own red trope, and tropes resemble each other. Explains similarity, and universals are eliminated, replaced by classes of resembling tropes, and this approach preserves some realist insights, accepts that properties are real, while avoiding commitment to abstract universals, and trope theory has been developed extensively, has become a major alternative to both traditional realism and nominalism, and provides a middle ground that many find attractive. The problem of universals also affects science, affects understanding what scientific laws are, because laws concern kinds, concern all electrons or all mammals, and laws seem to involve universals, seem to say that all objects instantiating a certain universal behave in certain ways, and if universals do not exist, then what are laws about? Are they merely regularities in particular objects? Are they conventions of our theorizing? And nominalists must explain how science discovers objective laws if kinds are not real, if universals do not exist. And this challenge drives some philosophers toward realism, toward accepting that kinds are real, that universals exist because science seems to require them. The red ball and red shirt share something or do not share anything, are similar by instantiating a universal or by resembling each other. And the problem of universals asks which, asks what properties are, whether they are real entities or linguistic conveniences, whether redness exists in Plato's heaven or in particular red things, or only in our conceptual scheme. And the answers divide philosophers, have divided them for millennia. And the problem remains unsolved, remains central to metaphysics, and redness exists everywhere in all red things. If realism is true, and nowhere if nominalism is true, and the problem persists, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology, a question about whether reality contains abstract repeatable entities, or only concrete unrepeatable particulars, and the universals wait, existing or not existing, and the problem endures. The ship of Theseus. A ship returns to harbour after a long voyage, its wooden planks weathered and damaged by storms and salt. And the repairs begin. One plank is removed and replaced with new wood, then another, and over months or years every single plank, every beam, every nail is replaced until nothing of the original materials remains. And yet it is still called the Ship of Theseus, still registered under the same name, still captained by the same crew, and the question arises, is it the same ship or a different ship? And if it is different, when did it become different? After the first plank was replaced, or the 10th, or the last, and where is the boundary between identity and change? The paradox is ancient, discussed by Greek and Roman philosophers, and it strikes at the heart of what it means for an object to persist through time, to remain itself despite losing and gaining parts. And the problem deepens when a second scenario is introduced. Imagine that all the original planks removed from the ship of Theseus are collected and stored, and then using only those original materials, a second ship is built, an exact replica assembled from the very wood that once formed the ship of Theseus. And now there are two ships, one that has been continuously repaired and one that is made entirely of the original materials. And which one is the true ship of Theseus, the one with continuity of form and function, or the one with continuity of material? The paradox has no clear answer, and different philosophical traditions offer different responses. Some argue that identity is determined by material composition, that an object is the sum of its parts, and so the ship made from original planks is the true ship of Theseus, even though it was disassembled and reassembled, while others argue that identity is determined by form and function, that what makes the ship is its structure and purpose, and so the continuously repaired ship retains its identity, even though none of its original material remains. Still others suggest that identity is conventional, a matter of social agreement and practical convenience, that there is no objective fact about which ship is the real ship of Theseus, only a question of what we choose to call it based on our needs and conventions. The paradox extends beyond ships to living organisms because the cells in the human body are constantly dying and being replaced. And over a period of years, almost every atom in the body is exchanged with the environment. And yet a person is considered the same person throughout their life. And so, what makes identity persist? Is it continuity of consciousness, continuity of memory, continuity of physical form, or something else entirely? The problem also appears in legal and ethical contexts. Questions about personal responsibility over time, whether a person who has changed dramatically is still accountable for actions committed decades earlier, whether a corporation that has replaced all its employees and assets is still the same entity bound by old contracts, whether a nation that has undergone revolution and transformation retains the obligations of its former government. Some philosophers embrace a four-dimensionalist view, arguing that objects are not three-dimensional things that persist through time, but four-dimensional space-time worms, extended through time as well as space, and that what we call the ship of Theseus is really a temporally extended object, a continuous path through space-time, and the question of identity becomes a question of how we slice that four-dimensional object into temporal parts. Others reject this view, insisting that objects exist wholly at each moment, that the ship of Theseus at one time is numerically identical to the ship of Theseus at another time, if there is the right kind of continuity between them, though what counts as the right kind of continuity remains disputed. The ship of Theseus paradox remains unsolved, a puzzle that philosophy has examined for over 2 millennia without reaching consensus, and it stands as a reminder that identity, persistence, and change are not as straightforward as they seem, that the question of what makes something the same thing over time is one of the deepest and most difficult in metaphysics, and that the world we navigate, full of objects and people and institutions that seem to endure, may be far more fluid and ambiguous than common sense suggests. The Sorites paradox: a single grain of sand is not a heap, this much seems certain, and adding one grain of sand to something that is not a heap does not suddenly create a heap. One grain cannot make that much difference, and yet if you continue adding grains one by one, at some point you will have a heap, perhaps after 1,000 grains, perhaps 10,000, but surely 1,000,000 grains of sand piled together constitute a heap. And so somewhere in the process of adding individual grains, a heap must have come into existence, but where, after which grain? And this is the Sorites paradox, named from the Greek word for heap, a puzzle about vague predicates and the boundaries of concepts that has troubled philosophers since ancient times. The paradox can be constructed for almost any vague term. A man with a full head of hair is not bald, and removing one hair does not make a bald man. One hair cannot be the difference between bald and not bald, and yet removing hairs one by one will eventually result in baldness. Or consider a tall person. If someone is tall, then removing 1 millimeter from their height does not make them not tall. 1 millimeter is imperceptible, insignificant, and yet removing millimeters one by one will eventually result in someone who is clearly not tall. And the same pattern applies to colours, to wealth, to age, to nearly every predicate we use in ordinary language. And in each case we are forced to accept either that there is a sharp boundary, a precise number of grains or hairs or millimeters that marks the transition, which seems arbitrary and implausible, or that there is no boundary at all, which leads to the absurd conclusion that no amount of sand is a heap, no person is bald, no one is tall, because the reasoning that prevents one grain from making a difference applies equally to every grain. The paradox exposes the vagueness inherent in natural language, the fact that most of our concepts do not have sharp boundaries, but instead fade gradually from clear cases to borderline cases to clear non-cases, and this vagueness creates logical problems because classical logic assumes that every statement is either true or false, that predicates have determinate extensions, that there is a fact of the matter about whether any given collection of sand grains is a heap, but vague predicates resist this bivalent structure, and the Sorites paradox forces us to choose between preserving classical logic and accepting sharp boundaries, or rejecting classical logic and developing new logical systems that can handle vagueness. Some philosophers bite the bullet and accept that vague predicates have sharp boundaries, that there is a precise number of hairs that separates bald from not bald, even though we do not and perhaps cannot know what that number is. And they argue that this is no more mysterious than other forms of ignorance, that epistemicism, the view that vagueness is ignorance of sharp boundaries, preserves classical logic at the cost of accepting counterintuitive, hidden thresholds. Others reject sharp boundaries and embrace many-valued logic or fuzzy logic, systems where statements can be partially true, where being a heap admits of degrees, where a collection of grains can be somewhat a heap, more of a heap than another collection, but less of a heap than a third, and truth values range continuously from 0 to 1, rather than being restricted to true and false. Still others argue that vague predicates are context sensitive, that what counts as a heap depends on the purposes and standards operative in a given context, that in some contexts a small pile might count as a heap, while in others only a large pile would, and so there is no absolute fact about heaphood, only relative facts indexed to contexts. The Sorites paradox also has practical implications. In law, where vague terms like reasonable or substantial must be applied to real cases. In medicine, where diagnoses depend on thresholds that are often vague. In ethics, where drawing lines between permissible and impermissible actions may require arbitrary boundaries that the Sorites reasoning undermines. And in these domains, the paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a genuine challenge to decision-making and judgment. The paradox remains unresolved. Philosophers continue to debate the best response, and it stands as a reminder that the concepts we use to navigate the world, the words we rely on to describe and categorize, are far less precise than we ordinarily assume, that vagueness is pervasive, that boundaries are often illusory, and that the attempt to force the fluid and gradual into the rigid and discrete, to impose the structure of classical logic on the messy reality of natural language, leads inevitably to paradox, to situations where reasoning breaks down, where every answer seems wrong, and where the heap, like so many things, resists definition. The stone paradox, another way to ask if God can defeat God's self. The question appears in different forms across centuries, always pointing to the same underlying puzzle about unlimited power, and one formulation asks whether an all-powerful being can create a stone so massive that even infinite strength cannot move it. And this is the stone paradox, essentially identical to the omnipotence paradox, but focusing specifically on physical objects and physical power. And the logic is the same. Either the being can create the unmovable stone, which means there is something the being cannot do, namely move the stone, or the being cannot create the unmovable stone, which means there is something the being cannot create, and in both cases the being's power has limits. And the concept of all-powerful collapses, and this formulation emphasizes the physical, intuitive aspect of the puzzle, makes it concrete, gives it visual force, because we can imagine trying to lift a stone. Imagine straining against weight, and the idea of a stone too heavy for even infinite strength captures the paradox in a visceral way that abstract formulations about logical possibility sometimes miss. Imagine the stone, vast beyond imagining, extending across space, dense with compressed matter, so heavy that it curves space-time around itself, creates gravitational wells, warps reality by its mere presence, and the being approaches, grasps the stone, applies force, and the stone does not move, remains fixed in space, immovable. And this defeat, this failure, seems to show that the being is not all-powerful, and yet the being created this stone, shaped it specifically to be unmovable. And if the being can create such a stone, then the being has a power that contradicts itself, a power to create constraints that the power itself cannot overcome. And this self-defeating power seems incoherent, seems to be no power at all. And so we are driven back to the conclusion that creating such a stone is impossible. But then the being cannot create everything imaginable, cannot create every physical object, and again, the being is not all-powerful. The stone paradox is sometimes presented as a reductio ad absurdum of the concept of omnipotence, an argument that shows omnipotence is logically impossible, that no being could have unlimited power, that power must have limits, and if omnipotence is impossible, then no being is omnipotent, not even God. And this conclusion challenges traditional theology, challenges the claim that God is all-powerful, and requires either rejecting omnipotence as a divine attribute or redefining it in a way that avoids the paradox. And theologians have generally chosen the second option, have argued that omnipotence does not mean literally unlimited power, but rather maximal power consistent with logical coherence. And this means God can do anything that is logically possible, but not things that involve contradictions. And creating an unmovable stone that one can then move is a contradiction. And so God's inability to do it is not a limitation, but a reflection of logical necessity. The stone paradox also has variants involving self-limitation, questions about whether God can limit God's own power, can voluntarily give up omnipotence, can create a situation where God is no longer all-powerful. And these questions are theologically interesting because they relate to the incarnation, to the Christian claim that God became human in Christ. And being human involves limitations, involves not being omnipotent, and so did God limit divine power when becoming incarnate? And if so, does this mean God is no longer omnipotent? And if God can limit divine power, does this show that God is not essentially omnipotent? And these questions have generated extensive theological debate about the relationship between Christ's human nature and divine nature, about whether limitations apply to God as a whole or only to the human aspect. And the stone paradox in these variants touches on central mysteries of Christology and Trinitarian theology. The paradox can also be understood as a question about necessity and possibility, about whether there are constraints that even an all-powerful being must respect. And the response that God cannot do logically impossible things is a claim that logical necessity is more fundamental than power, that even God cannot violate logic, And this has implications for metaphysics, for the question of what grounds logical truths, whether they are independent of God or created by God. And if they are independent, then there is something God does not control, something that limits divine sovereignty. And if they are created by God, then the claim that God cannot violate logic becomes the claim that God cannot do what God has decided is impossible. And this seems to restore divine sovereignty, but raises questions about whether God could have made different logical truths, could have made contradictions possible. And these questions push the limits of coherent thought. Some philosophers have argued that the stone paradox shows that power itself is incoherent as an unlimited concept, that just as there cannot be a largest possible number, because any number can be exceeded by adding one, there cannot be an unlimited power, because any supposed unlimited power can be challenged by asking whether it can create a limit to itself. And this suggests that power is always relational, always defined relative to tasks and capacities. And the idea of absolute power, power not relative to anything, is an illusion, a category mistake. And so the paradox does not refute the existence of very powerful beings, does not show that God cannot be maximally powerful within the constraints of coherence, but it does show that certain formulations of omnipotence, certain claims about unlimited power, are not logically tenable. The stone sits in conceptual space, hypothetical and impossible, and the being stands before it, and the question hangs: can the stone be created? Can it be moved? And the answer shapes theology, shapes metaphysics, shapes our understanding of what power is and what limits even ultimate power must respect. And the stone paradox remains a vivid, concrete formulation of deep abstract questions about possibility, coherence, and the boundaries of divine ability. And it stands alongside the omnipotence paradox as a permanent challenge to simplistic claims about unlimited power. A reminder that even theology must answer to logic, that concepts must cohere, and that the nature of God, if God exists, is more subtle and more constrained by reason than some believers want to admit. And the stone paradox persists, waiting in every discussion of omnipotence, ready to challenge every claim that God can do anything, pushing always toward qualification, toward clarification, toward the recognition that anything means anything logically possible, and that even divine power operates within the bounds of coherence. The temporal loop paradox. Time travel narratives often stumble into a peculiar trap, one where causation forms a perfect circle with no discernible beginning, and this is the temporal loop paradox, a scenario where events cause themselves through the mechanism of time travel, creating a chain of causation that has no origin outside the loop itself. Imagine a scientist who receives a mysterious package containing detailed blueprints for a time machine, blueprints that are far beyond anything current science could produce, and the scientist follows these instructions exactly, building the machine over many years, and once it is complete they use it to travel back in time to their younger self, where they mail the very same blueprints that they received decades earlier. And so the blueprints travel from future to past in an endless cycle, created by no one, authored by no one, simply existing within the loop. The paradox is that the information has no source. It was never invented or discovered. It merely circulates through time, and the same pattern can apply to objects, people, or even entire chains of events, creating closed causal loops, where every event is both cause and effect, where nothing enters the loop from outside and nothing leaves, a self-contained system that violates the intuition that everything must have an origin, that causes must precede effects in a linear chain stretching back to some first cause. Some physicists argue that such loops are permitted by the equations of general relativity, which allow for closed time-like curves under certain exotic conditions, space-time paths that circle back on themselves so that travelling forward in time eventually brings you to your own past. And if such curves exist, then temporal loops are possible, strange but not contradictory. Others find the loops deeply troubling, a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that everything must have an explanation, that there must be a reason why the blueprints contain the information they do, but in a temporal loop, there is no reason, no explanation. The information simply is, trapped in eternal recurrence. The loop also raises questions about entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, which states that disorder always increases over time. Yet in a temporal loop, information or objects would circulate indefinitely, without decay, never accumulating errors, never losing coherence. And this seems to violate the fundamental arrow of time that thermodynamics imposes. Some theorists suggest that quantum mechanics might prevent such loops, that the probabilistic nature of quantum events would introduce small variations each time the loop repeats, causing the information to degrade over successive iterations until the loop breaks down, while others propose that consistency conditions might force the loop to be stable, that only perfectly self-consistent loops can exist, and any deviation would create contradictions that the universe does not permit. The temporal loop paradox differs from the predestination paradox in emphasis, where predestination focuses on the inevitability of events and the loss of free will. The temporal loop focuses on the absence of origins and the circular nature of causation. And both paradoxes share the unsettling feature that time travel does not change the past because the time traveler was always part of that past, their actions already woven into the fabric of history. The loop sits outside normal causation, neither created nor destroyed, neither beginning nor ending, a strange attractor in the space of possible timelines, and it forces confrontation with the question of whether the universe requires ultimate origins, whether infinite regress is possible, whether some things can simply be without explanation, and whether time is truly linear, or whether it can fold back on itself in ways that make causation circular rather than hierarchical. The temporal loop remains a staple of science fiction and a puzzle for philosophers and physicists, a scenario that feels impossible, yet may be consistent with the laws of nature, a reminder that time is stranger than common sense suggests, and that the arrow of causation we perceive, flowing from past to future, from cause to effect, may not be as fundamental as we believe, may not be the only way events can be structured, and that reality may permit loops and circles where intuition insists there should be lines. The trolley problem: would you kill one person to save 5? A runaway trolley speeds down a track, out of control, and ahead on the track 5 people are tied up, unable to move, unaware of the approaching danger, and the trolley will kill them all unless something is done. And you stand next to a lever that controls a switch, and if you pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted onto a side track, and on that side track, 1 person is tied up, and pulling the lever will save the 5 people, but will kill the 1 person, and you have seconds to decide. And the question is asked: should you pull the lever? Should you actively cause 1 person's death to prevent 5 deaths? And this is the trolley problem, a thought experiment in ethics first formulated by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and later refined by Judith Jarvis Thomson. And the problem has generated endless debate about the nature of moral responsibility, about the difference between killing and letting die, about whether the consequences of an action are all that matter or whether the act itself has moral significance, independent of outcomes. Visualize the scenario: the track stretches ahead, the 5 people bound and helpless, the trolley barreling toward them, unstoppable, and you at the switch, hand on the lever, and time slows as you deliberate. If you do nothing, 5 people die. If you pull the lever, 1 person dies, and the arithmetic seems simple. 5 is greater than 1. Saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 is a net gain. And by this consequentialist reasoning, you should pull the lever. You should minimize harm, maximize lives saved. And many people, when presented with this scenario, say they would pull the lever, would divert the trolley, would accept responsibility, for causing one death to prevent 5. But now consider a variation, the Fat Man variant, also called the footbridge scenario, where you stand on a bridge above the tracks, and the trolley is approaching below, heading toward the 5 people, and next to you on the bridge stands a very large person, large enough that if pushed off the bridge, they would fall onto the tracks, and their body would stop the trolley, saving the 5 people, but killing the large person. And you could push this person, could use their body as an obstruction, and the outcome is the same as before. 5 people saved, 1 person killed, and yet when presented with this scenario, most people say they would not push, would not use the large person as a means to stop the trolley, even though the consequences are identical to the lever case. 5 saved, 1 killed, and this asymmetry, this difference in moral intuition between the 2 cases despite the same outcome, is what makes the trolley problem so philosophically interesting. It reveals that our moral judgments are not based purely on consequences, not purely on maximizing lives saved, but also on how those lives are saved, on whether the harm is direct or indirect, on whether someone is used as a means or merely affected as a side effect. The distinction involves the doctrine of double effect, a principle in ethics that says there is a moral difference between intending harm as a means to an end versus foreseeing harm as an unintended side effect. In the lever case, pulling the lever is intended to divert the trolley, and the death of the 1 person is a foreseen but unintended side effect. The 1 person dies because they happen to be on the diverted track, but their death is not the means by which the 5 are saved. The means is the diversion itself, whereas in the Fat Man case, pushing the person is intended precisely to use their body to stop the trolley. Their death is the means by which the 5 are saved, and this makes the act feel more like murder, more like using a person as a tool. And the doctrine of double effect says that intending harm as a means is morally worse than foreseeing harm as a side effect, even if the outcomes are identical. Critics argue that this distinction is spurious, that consequences are what matter, that if 5 lives are saved and 1 life is lost, the moral calculus is the same, regardless of how the result is achieved, and utilitarians, who judge actions by their consequences, say that both pulling the lever and pushing the large person are morally required if they maximize overall welfare, and any moral theory that forbids saving 5 lives to avoid directly causing 1 death is absurd, is giving too much weight to squeamishness or moral intuitions that evolved in contexts very different from modern ethical dilemmas. But defenders of deontological ethics, ethics based on duties and rules rather than consequences, argue that people have rights, that using someone as a means without their consent violates their dignity, that not all ways of achieving good outcomes are permissible, and that the Fat Man case is wrong precisely because it treats the large person as a mere tool, as an object to be sacrificed for the greater good. And this violates the Kantian principle that people are ends in themselves, never merely means. The trolley problem also raises questions about moral responsibility and causation, because in the lever case, you cause the death of the 1 person by pulling the lever, you redirect the trolley, but in the do-nothing case, you do not cause the death of the 5 people. The trolley causes their deaths, and you merely fail to prevent it. And some moral theories distinguish between killing and letting die, between acts and omissions, and say that killing is worse than letting die, that actively causing harm carries more moral weight than passively allowing harm. And by this reasoning, pulling the lever might be wrong because it involves killing, whereas doing nothing involves only letting die. But this asymmetry is controversial. Many philosophers argue that there is no deep moral difference between killing and letting die, that if you can prevent 5 deaths at the cost of 1 death, you should do so, regardless of whether the mechanism involves action or inaction. Visualize standing at the lever, frozen by indecision, the trolley approaching, the seconds ticking away, and your mind races through arguments, through principles, through gut reactions, and different moral frameworks give different answers. Consequentialism says pull, deontology says maybe not. Virtue ethics asks what a virtuous person would do, and the answer is not obvious, depends on which virtues are relevant: courage, compassion, respect for autonomy, and the problem reveals that our moral intuitions are not consistent, not unified by a single principle, but are a patchwork of different considerations, different values that sometimes conflict. And in hard cases like the trolley problem, these conflicts become explicit, become impossible to ignore, and we must choose which principle to prioritize, which value to uphold. And there is no algorithm, no formula that tells us the right answer, only judgment, only the difficult work of weighing competing considerations and making a choice we can live with. The trolley problem has been studied empirically. Psychologists have presented it to thousands of subjects, measuring their responses, looking for patterns, and the results confirm that most people distinguish between the lever and the fat man cases. Most would pull the lever, but not push the fat man. And brain imaging studies suggest that different parts of the brain are involved. The lever case activates regions associated with reasoning and calculation, while the fat man case activates regions associated with emotion and social cognition. And this suggests that our moral judgments involve both rational deliberation and emotional response, both utilitarian calculation and deontological intuition, and different scenarios trigger different systems. And the tension between these systems is what makes moral dilemmas difficult. What makes them dilemmas? Cases where no answer satisfies all our moral intuitions, where any choice involves sacrifice, involves accepting consequences or violating principles. And the trolley problem, artificial as it is, captures this structure, this irreducible difficulty that characterizes real moral life. The trolley speeds on, the people lie helpless, the lever waits, and the choice must be made: pull or don't pull, act or refrain, and the problem offers no comfort, no easy answer, only the recognition that morality is hard, that lives are at stake, that our choices matter, and that sometimes there is no right answer, only answers that feel less wrong. And the trolley problem endures, not because it resembles real dilemmas we face, but because it distills the structure of moral conflict, because it forces explicit the trade-offs we usually avoid, and because it reminds us that ethics is not a set of rules to be followed mechanically, but a practice requiring judgment, requiring courage, requiring the willingness to make difficult choices and accept responsibility for their consequences. And the trolley rolls, and the lever waits, and the question persists. The waterfall, illusion, when staring at motion, makes stillness move. A person stands before a waterfall, watches the water cascade downward continuously, stares at the flowing water for several minutes, and then looks away, looks at the rocks beside the waterfall, and something strange happens. The rocks appear to move upward, appear to flow in the opposite direction from the water, even though the rocks are stationary, are not moving at all, and this upward motion is vivid, is compelling, lasts for several seconds before fading. And this is the waterfall illusion, also called the motion after effect, a phenomenon where prolonged viewing of motion in one direction causes stationary objects to appear to move in the opposite direction. And the illusion reveals something fundamental about how the visual system encodes motion. Reveals that motion perception involves opponent processes, involves neurons tuned to opposite directions that inhibit each other, and adaptation occurs. And when you stare at downward motion, the downward tuned neurons adapt, become less responsive. And when you look at stationary objects, the balance between upward and downward motion signals is disrupted. The upward neurons are relatively more active than the adapted downward neurons, and this imbalance is interpreted as upward motion. And the waterfall illusion demonstrates neural adaptation, shows that perception is not a simple recording of stimulus properties, but involves active processing that can be modified by experience, that can create illusions when adaptation disrupts normal balance. Imagine the neural mechanism, motion perception, involves direction-selective neurons, neurons that respond to motion in specific directions. And for every direction, there are neurons tuned to the opposite direction, and these opponent neurons inhibit each other, creating a balanced system. And when motion occurs in one direction, the corresponding neurons respond. Signal motion, and the opponent neurons are inhibited, remain quiet, and this balance signals the direction of motion. But when you stare at motion continuously, the responding neurons adapt, fire less strongly due to prolonged activation. And when motion stops, when you look at something stationary, both sets of neurons receive no motion signal, but the adapted neurons are less responsive than the non-adapted neurons, and this creates an imbalance. The non-adapted neurons are relatively more active, and this imbalance is interpreted as motion in their preferred direction, and the waterfall illusion occurs. You see motion where there is none. The waterfall illusion is not limited to waterfalls, can be produced by any prolonged viewing of continuous motion. Staring at rotating spirals produces rotation after effects. Staring at expanding patterns produces contraction after effects. Staring at leftward motion produces rightward after effects. And the phenomenon is robust, is easy to demonstrate, can be experienced by anyone willing to stare at motion for a minute or two, and neuroscientists have studied the illusion extensively, have identified the neural mechanisms, have shown that adaptation occurs in early visual cortex, in areas like V1 and MT that process motion, and the illusion provides a window into neural processing, provides evidence for opponent mechanisms, for adaptation, for the neural basis of motion perception. Visualize the waterfall illusion as revealing that perception is relative, is based on comparisons, and motion is detected not as absolute velocity, but as a difference between signals from direction-selective neurons, and adaptation shifts the baseline, changes what counts as balanced, and after adaptation, stillness looks like motion, because the adapted system interprets stillness as imbalance. And this relativity is a feature, not a bug, is how the system efficiently encodes information, maintains sensitivity across a wide range of motion speeds by adjusting its response properties through adaptation. And the waterfall illusion is a side effect, a case where adaptation produces illusion. But the mechanism is the same mechanism that normally allows accurate motion perception in varying conditions. The waterfall illusion also has implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you perceive in the illusion is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion in terms of subjective experience. You really see the rocks moving, really experience motion, and yet no motion occurred, no physical movement in the stimulus. And this shows that conscious experiences are neural states, are patterns of brain activity that can be triggered by stimulation or by adaptation or by hallucination, and the content of experience does not uniquely determine its cause. The same experience can arise from different sources, and this supports the view that consciousness is a brain process, that experiences are states of the neural system rather than properties of external objects. And the waterfall illusion makes this vivid, shows that motion experience can exist without motion in the world. One philosophical implication concerns the reliability of perception, because if adaptation can cause illusions, can make you see motion where there is none, then how can we trust perception? How can we rely on sensory experience as a source of knowledge? And the answer is that we trust perception in context. We recognize that under normal conditions, perception is reliable, and unusual conditions like prolonged staring at motion are unusual, create temporary disruptions, and we can identify these conditions, can recognize when perception is likely to be distorted, and the waterfall illusion is understood, is explained, is known to be illusory, and this knowledge itself comes from perception, from observing that rocks do not actually move, from comparing experience to reality, and perception self-corrects, is reliable overall, even when occasionally producing illusions. The waterfall illusion also connects to theories of neural coding, to understanding how the brain represents information, and the opponent process mechanism revealed by the illusion is found throughout sensory systems, in color vision, where opponent red, green, and blue-yellow mechanisms exist, in vestibular systems that signal head rotation through opponent mechanisms, and opponent coding is an efficient way to represent bipolar dimensions, dimensions that vary between opposite extremes, and motion direction is such a dimension, varies from leftward to rightward, or upward to downward, and using opponent neurons allows the system to signal direction efficiently, and adaptation is a natural consequence of this coding scheme, is how the system maintains sensitivity and adjusts to prevailing conditions. Another implication concerns the time course of perception, because the waterfall illusion has a specific temporal profile, lasts for several seconds after adaptation, and then fades, and this fading reflects recovery from adaptation, reflects the adapted neurons returning to their baseline responsiveness. And the time course reveals the dynamics of neural adaptation, reveals how quickly neurons adapt and how quickly they recover. And studying the waterfall illusion has provided quantitative data on adaptation rates, on recovery times, on the relationship between adaptation duration and after-effect strength. And this data constrains models of visual processing, provides benchmarks that models must match. The person stands beside the waterfall, looks away at the cliff face, and the rocks rise, flow upward in apparent motion. And nothing moves, but the person's perception moves. Reflects the adapted state of motion detectors, reflects the neural imbalance created by prolonged viewing of downward flow. And the illusion fades, and the rocks become still, and adaptation recovers, and balance is restored, and the waterfall illusion remains one of the most famous demonstrations in perceptual psychology, a phenomenon that reveals neural mechanisms, that shows adaptation, that illustrates opponent processes, that demonstrates the constructed nature of motion perception. And the illusion endures, simple to produce, robust in effect, profound in implication, showing that perception is not passive reception, but is active processing, is a system that adapts, that responds to its history, that can be fooled, but that normally works accurately. And the waterfall flows, and the rocks appear to rise, and the brain reveals its mechanisms through this beautiful, compelling illusion. Bradley's regress, why relations cannot connect anything. A philosopher named F.H. Bradley examines how relations work, examines how objects stand in relations to each other, how one thing is connected to another through relations like larger than, or next to, or causes, and Bradley discovers a problem, a regress that shows relations cannot do the work they are supposed to do, cannot actually connect objects. And the regress goes as follows. Suppose object A is related to object B by relation R, and now ask what connects A to R. What relates the object to the relation, and there must be another relation, call it R prime, that connects A to R. And now what connects A to R prime? There must be another relation R double prime, and the regress continues infinitely. Infinite relations needed to connect A to B through R. And the regress is vicious because each relation requires further relations to do its connecting work. And the connection never grounds, never actually occurs, and so relations do not relate, do not connect objects. And if relations cannot connect, then reality is not structured by relations, is not composed of objects standing in relations. And this is Bradley's regress, an argument against the reality of relations, an argument that shows relations are impossible, are self-defeating, and Bradley concludes that relations are unreal, are appearances rather than genuine features of reality. An ultimate reality is an undifferentiated whole, the absolute, where all apparent multiplicity and relationality dissolve into unity. Imagine two objects, a red ball and a blue ball, and the relation larger than connecting them. The red ball is larger than the blue ball, and ask how this relation connects the balls. How larger than relates the red ball to the blue ball, and there must be something that connects the red ball to the relation larger than, another relation R1, and something that connects R1 to the red ball, another relation R2. And infinite relations are needed, each requiring another relation to connect it, and the larger than relation never actually connects the balls, because the connection requires infinite intermediaries, infinite relations, and the regress shows that positing relations does not explain connection, does not explain how objects stand in relations, only pushes the question back infinitely. Bradley's regress challenges the common sense view that reality consists of objects and relations, challenges the idea that the world has relational structure, that things stand in relations to each other, and if Bradley is right, then relations are impossible, are not genuine features of reality, and the world does not have the structure we think it has, is not composed of separate objects standing in relations, but is somehow unified, is an undifferentiated whole, where separation and relation are illusions generated by thought. And this radical monism, this view that reality is one, follows from taking the regress seriously, from accepting that relations cannot relate and therefore do not exist. Visualize the regress as an infinite chain. A dash R dash B represents A related to B by R, but this structure is unstable, requires further relations R prime and R double prime to connect A to R and R to B. And these further relations require still more relations, and the chain extends infinitely in both directions. And the regress shows that relational structure is impossible, cannot ground, cannot explain how connection occurs, and Bradley uses this to argue for monism, for the view that reality is not many things related but is one thing appearing as many. One response to Bradley's regress denies that relations need relating, denies that the connection between object and relation requires a further relation, argues that relations just do relate, just do connect objects without needing intermediaries. And the regress assumes that relating requires a relation, but this assumption is false. Relations connect objects directly, intrinsically, by their nature, and no further relations are needed. And the regress does not start because the initial premise is rejected, and this response treats relating as primitive, as something relations do without explanation, without needing further entities to make them do it. Another response distinguishes between external and internal relations, argues that some relations are external, contingent, could be otherwise, and these might generate regress, but other relations are internal, necessary, grounded in the intrinsic properties of related objects, and internal relations do not require further relations to connect them because they are not separate entities but are grounded in the objects themselves. And the regress does not apply to internal relations, and while external relations might be problematic, internal relations are sufficient for much relational structure, are sufficient to ground many important connections. A third response appeals to non-relational theories, argues that what appear to be relations are really monadic properties of objects or are reducible to non-relational facts, and larger than is not a genuine relation but is grounded in the intrinsic sizes of objects. The red ball has size S1, the blue ball has size S2, and S1 exceeds S2, and no relation is needed, no larger than exists independently, and relational facts reduce to non-relational facts about properties, and Bradley's regress is avoided by eliminating relations, replacing them with properties, and this nominalist response preserves structure without positing relations as genuine entities. Bradley's regress also appears in discussions of properties and instantiation, because instantiation is a relation between objects and properties, and the regress applies if object A instantiates property P through instantiation relation I. Then what relates A to I? Another instantiation relation, I prime, and regress ensues, and various solutions have been proposed. Some deny that instantiation is a relation, argue that objects just have properties without needing an instantiation relation to connect them, and others distinguish between types of instantiation, first-order instantiation, between objects and properties, and second-order instantiation, between instantiation and its relata, and argue that the regress terminates, at some level, is not vicious. The regress has influenced debates about the nature of facts and propositions, because facts seem to be structured by relations, seem to involve objects standing in relations, and if relations generate regress, then facts are problematic. And some philosophers have abandoned facts, have argued that reality does not contain structured facts, but only objects and properties, and true propositions do not correspond to facts, but are made true by objects having properties, and Bradley's regress motivates this austere ontology, this rejection of facts, as genuine entities. The red ball sits next to the blue ball, related by spatial proximity, or appearing to be related, and Bradley's regress asks how this relation connects them. How next to does its connecting work? And the answer involves infinite regress, infinite relations, or involves denying that relations are real. And Bradley embraces the denial, accepts monism, accepts that reality is one undifferentiated whole. And modern philosophers mostly reject Bradley's conclusion, reject monism, but the regress remains a challenge, remains a puzzle about how relations work, how connection occurs, and various solutions exist, various ways of blocking the regress, but no consensus emerges. And Bradley's regress endures as a permanent challenge to relational metaphysics, a puzzle showing that the structure of reality, the way objects stand in relations, is more problematic than common sense suggests, and the regress continues, infinite relations chaining backward, and connection remains elusive. Why is there something rather than nothing? The question that breaks philosophy. A child asks the simplest and most profound question, looks at the world and wonders why it exists, why there is anything at all rather than empty void, blank nothingness, total absence of being. And this question has been called the fundamental question of metaphysics, has been asked by philosophers across centuries, has been approached from countless angles, and yet no satisfactory answer has emerged. No explanation that resolves the mystery, and the question persists, stubborn and unanswerable. And this very persistence suggests something deep, suggests that the question may be unanswerable. Not because we lack knowledge, but because answers are impossible, because the structure of explanation breaks down when applied to existence itself, because the question demands something that cannot be given. And this is why the question, why is there something rather than nothing, breaks philosophy, reveals limits of rational inquiry, shows that not all questions have answers, that mystery is ineliminable, and that existence is the ultimate brute fact, the foundation that supports all explanations, but cannot itself be explained without circularity or infinite regress. Imagine absolute nothingness more carefully, not empty space which is still something, not darkness which requires time and the absence of light, not even the potential for something, but pure nothing. No properties, no possibilities, no structure, no existence whatsoever. And from this pure nothing, ask how something could arise, what could cause the first thing to exist. And the problem is that causation requires existence, requires that there be things to cause effects, and pure nothing contains no causes, no mechanisms, no laws, nothing that could produce anything. And so the transition from nothing to something seems impossible, seems to violate every principle of explanation we have, and yet something exists, we exist. The universe exists, and so either something has always existed, no pure nothing ever obtained, or something arose from nothing, violated the principles, performed the impossible, and either option is difficult to accept. Either challenges fundamental assumptions about explanation and causation. The question, why is there something rather than nothing, presupposes that nothing is the default state, the natural condition, and something requires explanation, requires justification, requires accounting for why the default was departed from. But this presupposition is questionable. Why should nothing be privileged over something? Why should absence be more natural than presence? And perhaps something is just as natural as nothing, just as much the default, and the question dissolves, becomes a pseudo-question based on unjustified privileging of one state over another. And asking why something rather than nothing is like asking why up rather than down when there is no absolute reference frame, when up and down are arbitrary, and the question assumes something that should not be assumed. Visualize the logical space of possibilities. One possibility is that nothing exists. Another is that something exists. And the question asks why actuality corresponds to the something possibility rather than the nothing possibility. But this assumes that actuality could have corresponded to either, that both are genuine possibilities and perhaps nothing is not a genuine possibility. Perhaps nothingness is unstable, self-contradictory, cannot obtain, and something must exist. Existence is necessary. And the question is based on false assumption that nothing was ever a real alternative. And if nothing is impossible, then existence requires no explanation beyond its necessity, and the question collapses. One approach to the question appeals to the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything has an explanation, that for every fact there is a reason why it is so rather than otherwise. And this principle seems to demand an answer to why something rather than nothing seems to require that existence have explanation. But the principle leads to problems, leads to infinite regress if every explanation requires further explanation, or leads to circular explanation if the chain of reasons loops back. And perhaps the principle itself is false. Perhaps not everything has explanation. Perhaps existence is the brute fact, the unexplained explainer. The ground of reasons that itself has no reason, and accepting this requires abandoning the principle of sufficient reason, requires accepting that the demand for total explanation cannot be satisfied. Another approach appeals to God, argues that God exists necessarily, by divine nature, cannot fail to exist, and God created the universe, explains why something rather than nothing, but this pushes the question back, asks why God exists, why there is a necessary being rather than no necessary beings, and if God's existence is brute fact, then why not make the universe's existence brute fact? Why the extra step and theistic answers to the question seem to relocate the mystery rather than resolving it? Replace the mystery of why anything exists with the mystery of why God exists. And while some find this satisfying, find the existence of God less mysterious than the existence of a universe, others see no progress, see the same question at a different level. A third approach from quantum cosmology suggests that universes can arise from quantum fluctuations, that the vacuum is unstable, that particles pop into existence from nothing due to quantum indeterminacy, and perhaps the entire universe is a quantum fluctuation, arose from quantum vacuum without cause. And this seems to answer the question, explain something rather than nothing through quantum mechanics. But critics point out that quantum vacuum is not nothing, is a structure governed by laws, has properties and possibilities. And so the question becomes, why is there quantum vacuum rather than nothing? Why are there laws of quantum mechanics? And the question is pushed back but not answered. And quantum cosmology explains how our universe arose, but not why anything exists at all. The question also appears in theological contexts, in arguments about whether the universe requires a creator, whether existence points to God, and the cosmological argument says that the universe's existence requires explanation, and the explanation is God. But this argument faces the same problem. Why does God exist? And if God exists necessarily, then why can't the universe exist necessarily? And the theist and atheist reach an impasse, both accepting that something exists without ultimate explanation, disagreeing only about whether that something is God or the universe. And the fundamental question remains unanswered by both. And perhaps this reveals that the question is unanswerable, is beyond the reach of rational argument. Some philosophers conclude that the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is meaningless, is not a genuine question, is based on grammatical confusion, treats existence as if it were a property that things might have or lack when existence is not a property, but is the precondition for having properties, and asking why things have the property of existence is like asking why round things are shaped, is based on category error, and the question should be abandoned, recognized as pseudo-question, and philosophy should focus on questions that can meaningfully be asked and answered, and this deflationary response treats the question as linguistic confusion rather than deep mystery. Others embrace the mystery, accept that the question has no answer, that existence is the ultimate mystery, the foundation of everything, and confronting this mystery produces feelings of awe, wonder, recognition of the strangeness and precariousness of existence. The fact that there is something rather than nothing seems miraculous, seems gratuitous, seems like it did not have to be this way. And this feeling, this sense of wonder at existence itself, is one of the sources of both philosophy and religion. And the question, why is there something rather than nothing, even if unanswerable, is valuable, is worth asking, because it opens us to the fundamental mystery, reminds us that existence is not self-explanatory, is not inevitable, is something that calls out for explanation, even if no explanation can be given. The child asks why and the adult struggles to answer, offers various responses, scientific or theological or philosophical, and none fully satisfy, none explain why existence itself occurs, why being rather than non-being. And the question remains, breaks philosophy, reveals limits, shows that explanation must end somewhere, that understanding has boundaries, and perhaps this is the deepest lesson, that mystery is ineliminable, that existence is fundamentally inexplicable, and we must live with this, must accept that the most basic fact that something exists has no explanation, is just the way things are, and the question persists unanswered, echoing through philosophy, and existence remains strange and inexplicable, and the universe continues, and we ask why, and no answer comes, and the question endures. Gettier problems. For over 2,000 years, philosophers believed they had a satisfactory definition of knowledge, tracing back to Plato's dialogue Theaetetus, and this definition stated that knowledge is justified true belief, that to know a proposition, 3 conditions must be met. The proposition must be true, the believer must believe it, and the believer must have good reasons or justification for believing it. And this tripartite analysis seemed to capture what knowledge is, to distinguish genuine knowledge from lucky guesses, false beliefs, and unjustified opinions. And the definition was widely accepted, taught in textbooks, treated as settled wisdom, until 1963, when a philosopher named Edmund Gettier published a 3-page paper that shattered this consensus and transformed epistemology. Gettier presented cases, now known as Gettier problems or Gettier cases, where all 3 conditions for knowledge are satisfied, and yet intuitively the person does not have knowledge, where justified true belief is present but knowledge is absent. And these cases show that the traditional definition is insufficient, that something more is needed, though what that something is remains a matter of intense debate. The structure of a Gettier case typically involves a person who has a justified belief that happens to be true, but is true for reasons unrelated to the justification, where the justification is somehow defective or based on a falsehood, yet the belief turns out to be true by luck or coincidence. And this combination of justification and truth without the right kind of connection between them produces cases where we hesitate to attribute knowledge. Consider one of Gettier's original examples. Smith and Jones have applied for a job, and Smith has strong evidence that Jones will get the job. The president of the company told him so, and Smith also knows that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith counted them, and from these 2 pieces of evidence, Smith infers that the person who will get the job, has 10 coins in his pocket, and this inference is justified. It follows logically from what Smith believes he knows. But unbeknownst to Smith, it is actually Smith himself who will get the job. The president was mistaken or changed his mind. And by an extraordinary coincidence, Smith also has 10 coins in his pocket. And so Smith's belief that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket is true. And it is justified based on apparently good evidence. And yet Smith does not know this truth, because his belief is true for the wrong reasons. True because of a coincidence, rather than because of the facts that justified it. Another classic example involves a person looking at a clock. The clock reads 3 o'clock, and the person forms the belief that it is 3 o'clock. And this belief is justified because clocks are generally reliable sources of time information. But unbeknownst to the person, the clock stopped exactly 12 hours ago and just happens to be showing the correct time again. And so the belief is justified and true, but does not constitute knowledge because the truth is accidental, unconnected to the reason for belief. Gettier cases have proliferated. Philosophers have constructed hundreds of variations, each designed to test different theories of knowledge, each revealing new wrinkles in the concept, and the common thread is that the justification and the truth come apart. The belief is true, but not because of the justification, or the justification is based on a falsehood that happens to lead to a true conclusion, or the truth obtains for reasons the believer is unaware of. And in all these cases we feel that something is missing, that the person has justified true belief but lacks knowledge. The philosophical response to Gettier has been to add a fourth condition to the definition of knowledge, to supplement justified true belief with some additional requirement that rules out Gettier cases, and many such conditions have been proposed. Some argue for a no false lemmas condition, requiring that the justification not depend on any false beliefs, so that in the job case Smith's reasoning depended on the false belief that Jones would get the job, and this false lemma disqualifies the belief from being knowledge even though the conclusion is true. But this condition faces problems, because not all Gettier cases involve false lemmas. Some involve true beliefs that are justified by faulty processes or that happen to be true by luck without depending on any particular false intermediate belief. Others propose causal theories of knowledge, requiring that the belief be caused in the right way by the fact that makes it true, that there be a causal connection between the truth and the belief. And this would rule out the clock case, because the fact that it is 3 o'clock is not causally responsible for the clock showing 3 o'clock. The clock shows that time because it stopped 12 hours ago, not because it is currently 3 o'clock. But causal theories struggle with cases involving abstract objects or mathematical truths, where causal connections seem inappropriate or impossible. Reliabilist theories propose that knowledge requires belief to be produced by a reliable process, a process that generally produces true beliefs. And this seems to handle many Gettier cases, because the processes involved, like inferring from false beliefs or reading stopped clocks, are not reliable even if they happen to produce true beliefs in particular instances. But reliabilism faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify which process is operative in a given case, because any belief is produced by many processes at different levels of generality, and depending on how the process is described, it may be reliable or unreliable. Safety and sensitivity conditions have also been proposed. Safety requires that in nearby possible worlds, where the person still believes the proposition is still true, that the belief could not easily have been false. And sensitivity requires that in nearby worlds, where the proposition is false, the person would not believe it. And these modal conditions attempt to capture the idea that knowledge requires a stable connection between belief and truth, a connection that holds not just in the actual world, but in close counterfactual situations, but both conditions face counterexamples and refinements continue. Virtue epistemology offers another approach, suggesting that knowledge requires belief to be produced by the exercise of intellectual virtues, by cognitive abilities and skills that are credit to the agent. And on this view, Gettier cases fail to be knowledge, because the truth of the belief is not attributable to the cognitive abilities of the believer, but to luck or coincidence. But this raises questions about how to individuate abilities, about what counts as an exercise of skill versus a lucky outcome, and about whether knowledge really requires that the believer deserve credit for getting things right. The debate over Gettier cases has dominated analytic epistemology for over 60 years, generating thousands of papers, dozens of theories, and no clear consensus. And some philosophers have begun to question whether the project of defining knowledge in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions is misguided, whether knowledge is a natural kind with sharp boundaries, or whether it is a cluster concept, a family resemblance term that cannot be captured by a precise definition. And experimental philosophers have tested intuitions about Gettier cases across different cultures and demographics, finding some variation and raising questions about whose intuitions should guide philosophical theorizing. Gettier's legacy is immense. His 3-page paper demolished a definition that stood for millennia and launched an industry of epistemological research. And while the original problem, finding necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, remains unsolved, the attempt has deepened our understanding of justification, truth, belief, luck, causation, and the complex relationships between them. And Gettier cases continue to serve as test cases for theories of knowledge, as benchmarks that any adequate theory must handle. And they remind us that even our most basic concepts, even something as central as knowledge itself, are more complex and more elusive than they first appear, that definitions are hard to come by, that counterexamples lurk around every corner, and that the philosophical quest for clarity and precision is never-ending, always encountering new obstacles, new puzzles, new reasons to question what seemed settled. And Smith stands there with his 10 coins, believing truly and with justification that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, and yet he does not know. And this simple case, this small story about a job and some coins, contains within it a challenge that philosophy has not yet met, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a gap between justified true belief and knowledge that no fourth condition has successfully closed, and the search continues. Philosophers proposing new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding what knowledge is and what distinguishes it from mere lucky true belief. And Gettier watches from beyond the grave, his 3 pages having accomplished what few philosophical works ever do, fundamentally reshaping the discipline, forcing a rethinking of basic assumptions, proving that even ancient wisdom is vulnerable to counterexample, and that the road to philosophical truth is longer and more winding than we imagined. Gabriel's horn paradox, a 3-dimensional solid of revolution, is formed by taking the curve y equals 1 over x, for x greater than or equal to 1, and rotating it around the x-axis, and this creates a shape that resembles a horn or a trumpet, wide at one end near x equals 1, and tapering endlessly as x increases toward infinity, growing ever narrower but never closing, extending infinitely far in one direction. And this shape is called Gabriel's horn, named after the archangel whose trumpet signals the end of days. And the paradox is that this infinite horn has finite volume but infinite surface area. And this seems contradictory, or at least deeply strange, because if the volume is finite, then you could fill the horn with a finite amount of paint, but if the surface area is infinite, then you would need an infinite amount of paint to coat the surface. And so, it seems that you can fill the horn, but cannot paint it. And this apparent impossibility is Gabriel's horn paradox. The mathematics is straightforward. The volume of the horn is calculated using the formula for volumes of revolution, integrating from 1 to infinity the area of circular cross-sections. And the cross-section at position x has radius 1 over x, and so the area is pi times 1 over x squared. and integrating this from 1 to infinity gives pi a finite volume, meaning the horn could contain pi cubic units of liquid, and the surface area is calculated using the formula for surface area of revolution, integrating the circumference of each cross-section multiplied by an element of arc length. And this integral diverges. It grows without bound as the upper limit of integration increases, and so the surface area is infinite. And this combination, finite volume and infinite surface area, is what creates the paradox. The resolution of the paradox lies in recognizing that paint, as a physical substance, has thickness. It is not a mathematical surface with zero thickness, but a three-dimensional coating. And if the paint has any positive thickness, however small, then painting the inside of the horn requires filling a three-dimensional region, not just covering a surface, and the volume of this region is finite because it is contained within the horn, which has finite volume, and so a finite amount of paint suffices to coat the inside to any specified thickness, and the paradox dissolves. The apparent impossibility is an artifact of treating paint as if it were a zero-thickness mathematical surface, when in reality it is a substance with volume. Another way to see the resolution is to note that the distinction between filling and painting is not as sharp as it seems. Filling the horn means occupying its entire interior volume, while painting the surface means adding a thin layer. But if the layer has thickness, then painting is a form of filling a thin shell around the surface, and since the horn has finite volume, any shell within it also has finite volume, and so painting, properly understood, requires only a finite amount of paint. And the paradox arises from conflating mathematical surface area, which can be infinite, with physical coating, which requires volume, and volume is finite. Gabriel's horn also raises questions about the nature of infinity in geometry, about what it means for a geometric object to be infinite, and whether infinite objects can have finite properties, and the horn shows that they can. That infinite extent in one dimension, length, is compatible with finite extent in another dimension, volume, and this is not unique to the horn. Many geometric objects exhibit similar behavior: infinite regions with finite area, infinite surfaces with finite curvature. And these examples show that infinity is not a single uniform concept, but comes in degrees and dimensions, and that intuitions about finite objects do not always transfer to infinite objects. The paradox also appears in discussions of limits and convergence, because the volume integral converges to a finite value, while the surface area integral diverges. And this difference reflects the rates at which the integrands decrease as x increases. The volume integral decreases like 1 over x squared, fast enough that the sum over an infinite range is finite, while the surface area integral decreases like 1 over x, not fast enough to produce a finite sum. And this distinction between different rates of decay is central to analysis and calculus, determining which infinite series converge and which diverge, which integrals are finite and which are infinite. Some philosophers and mathematicians have used Gabriel's horn to argue about the nature of mathematical existence, about whether infinite objects like the horn really exist or are merely useful fictions, because the horn cannot be physically realized. No physical material extends infinitely, and no physical process could construct an infinite shape. And so, the horn is an idealization, a mathematical abstraction, and the paradox, if it is one, is a feature of this abstraction rather than a claim about physical reality. And this raises the question of whether mathematical paradoxes reveal truths about an independent mathematical realm or merely expose the limits of our abstractions and idealizations. Gabriel's horn has also been used in pedagogy to teach students about improper integrals, about the difference between convergence of volume and surface area, about the importance of careful calculation and the dangers of relying on intuition. And the paradox is memorable. It sticks in the mind, a striking example that challenges assumptions and forces students to think carefully about what integration measures and what infinity means. And for these reasons, the horn remains a staple of calculus courses, a classic example that generations of students have encountered and puzzled over. The horn extends to infinity, narrowing as it goes, its volume contained, its surface spreading without bound. And the paradox asks whether this makes sense, whether an object can be filled but not painted. And the answer is that paint has thickness, that coating requires volume, that mathematical surfaces and physical substances are different, and that the paradox is resolved by attending carefully to what filling and painting actually mean, and the horn remains. A beautiful and strange geometric object, a shape that embodies the counterintuitive properties of infinity. A reminder that infinite objects do not behave like finite objects scaled up, but follow their own logic, their own rules, and that intuition, trained on the finite, is an unreliable guide to the infinite. And Gabriel's horn sounds on, infinite in reach but finite in substance. A paradox that is no paradox once understood. A puzzle that teaches about integration, about infinity, about the relationship between mathematical idealization and physical reality, and about the need to distinguish between what can be calculated and what can be realized, between the abstract and the concrete, between the mathematical and the material. And the horn remains, a fixture in mathematics, a lesson in calculus, a paradox that resolves itself once the terms are clarified, once the mathematics is understood, once the nature of paint and surfaces and volume is properly considered, and the paradox fades, leaving behind understanding, leaving behind a deeper appreciation for the subtleties of infinite geometry, and for the care required when reasoning about objects that extend without end. Inattentional blindness. Why a gorilla walks through your vision. Unseen. A person watches a video, follows instructions to count how many times basketball players wearing white shirts pass the ball, and they count carefully, focus on the white team, track the passes, and reach a final count. And then they are asked whether they noticed anything unusual, and they say no, nothing unusual, just basketball players passing the ball. And then they watch the video again, this time without counting, and they are shocked to see that a person in a gorilla suit walked through the middle of the scene, stopped in the center, beat their chest, and walked off. And this gorilla was visible for 9 seconds, passed directly through the action, was large and obvious, and yet the person did not see it the first time, was completely unaware, was blind to the gorilla despite looking directly at it. And this is inattentional blindness, demonstrated famously by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabray in their invisible gorilla experiment, a phenomenon showing that attention is necessary for conscious perception, that we can look directly at something and not see it if we are not attending to it. And inattentional blindness reveals that perception is not simply determined by what falls on the retina, but is determined by what receives attention. And without attention, even salient obvious stimuli can be invisible, can pass unnoticed. And this challenges the idea that we consciously perceive everything in our visual field, shows that consciousness is limited to attended stimuli, and inattentional blindness has profound implications for understanding attention, consciousness, and the limits of awareness. Imagine the experience from the inside. You're focused on counting passes, tracking the white shirts, following the ball as it moves, and your attention is fully engaged, is consumed by the counting task. And the gorilla walks through, but you do not notice it. It does not register, does not enter consciousness. And the reason is that your attention is elsewhere, is focused on the white team. And the gorilla is not relevant to the task, is not expected, is not attended to. And without attention, the gorilla remains unconscious, remains invisible, despite being visible in the sense that the image falls on your retina, that your eyes are open and pointing at it. And this distinction between seeing with the eyes and seeing with attention reveals that conscious vision requires more than physical stimulation, requires attention, requires that processing reach a certain level. And inattentional blindness shows what happens when this does not occur, shows that stimuli can be physically present but mentally absent. Inattentional blindness differs from change blindness in that it occurs even without the need for comparison, occurs for stimuli that are continuously present, not just for changes, and the phenomenon shows that attention operates not just to encode changes, but to enable any conscious perception. And when attention is fully engaged elsewhere, when there is no spare attentional capacity, even salient, unexpected stimuli are missed, are not processed to the level of consciousness. And this demonstrates that attention is a limited resource, cannot be allocated to everything simultaneously, and when fully allocated to one task, nothing else reaches awareness, and the gorilla illustrates this dramatically, is an unexpected, salient stimulus that should capture attention, that would capture attention under normal circumstances. But when attention is fully engaged in counting passes, the gorilla is filtered out, is processed pre-consciously, but does not reach awareness. Visualize attention as a gate, and stimuli must pass through the gate to reach consciousness, and the gate is narrow, allows only a limited number of stimuli through, and when the gate is occupied by task-relevant stimuli, by the white-shirted players and the ball, irrelevant stimuli like the gorilla are blocked, are filtered out, and processing of the gorilla stops at an early stage, extracts basic features, but does not construct a conscious representation, and the gorilla remains invisible. And this gating model explains inattentional blindness, explains why stimuli that are physically present can be perceptually absent, because consciousness requires passing through the attentional gate, and only attended stimuli pass through. Inattentional blindness has practical implications for understanding accidents, for recognizing that drivers can look directly at pedestrians or other vehicles and not see them if attention is focused elsewhere. And looking is not the same as seeing. Vision requires attention, and when attention is engaged with navigation or conversation or phone use, stimuli outside the focus of attention can be missed, and this contributes to accidents, to collisions that seem inexplicable because the driver was looking, had clear sight lines, but did not see, did not notice the hazard. And understanding inattentional blindness is crucial for improving road safety, for recognizing the limits of human perception, and for designing systems that account for these limits. The phenomenon also has implications for understanding consciousness, for debates about whether consciousness requires attention, whether you can be conscious of unattended stimuli, and inattentional blindness suggests that consciousness requires attention, that unattended stimuli are not conscious, are processed unconsciously, and consciousness is limited to the small set of attended stimuli. And this supports the view that consciousness is sparse, is not the rich field of awareness we subjectively experience, but is a narrow spotlight that illuminates only what attention selects. And the subjective richness is an illusion, is created by the fact that attention moves rapidly, samples different regions, and wherever it lands, detail emerges. And we confuse this serial sampling with parallel richness, assume that because detail is available everywhere, it must be present everywhere. But inattentional blindness shows this is false, shows that unattended regions are not conscious, are invisible, even when physically visible. One response to inattentional blindness argues that some stimuli do capture attention automatically, do break through even when attention is engaged elsewhere, and highly salient or biologically significant stimuli like your own name or threatening faces or sudden loud noises capture attention, override current focus, and enter awareness. And this suggests that inattentional blindness is not absolute, is not a complete gate that blocks all unattended stimuli, but is a selective filter that allows some stimuli through based on salience and relevance. And the gorilla, while salient, is not personally relevant, not threatening, not expected, and so does not capture attention, does not override the counting task. And this response preserves some role for stimulus-driven attention, while acknowledging that inattentional blindness demonstrates the dominance of goal-directed attention. Another implication concerns legal contexts, concerns eyewitness testimony, and the reliability of visual reports. Because if people can miss large obvious stimuli like gorillas when attention is engaged elsewhere, then eyewitnesses can miss critical details of crimes, can fail to notice perpetrators or weapons or actions, even when looking directly at the scene. And this challenges the assumption that eyewitnesses see everything, that memory failures are due to forgetting rather than to never encoding. And inattentional blindness shows that encoding requires attention, and attention is limited, and eyewitnesses cannot be expected to have noticed everything, and testimony must be evaluated with this in mind, must recognize the limits of attention and perception. The gorilla walks through the frame, visible and obvious, and yet unseen, unnoticed, invisible, due to inattention, due to the focus on counting passes, and the phenomenon reveals that consciousness requires attention, that seeing requires more than physical stimulation, requires cognitive engagement, requires processing resources that are limited, and when fully allocated elsewhere, nothing else reaches awareness, and the gorilla remains hidden. Hidden not by camouflage or occlusion, but by inattention, by the filter that protects consciousness from overload, that selects what matters and ignores the rest. And inattentional blindness endures as one of the most striking demonstrations in psychology, a phenomenon that challenges naive assumptions about perception, that shows the limits of awareness, that reveals consciousness as sparse and selective, and the gorilla continues to walk unseen through countless viewings, invisible to half the viewers, shocking to those who missed it, and the phenomenon persists, demonstrating that attention is the gateway to consciousness, and without attention, even gorillas are invisible.